The Galactic Defense Academy, nestled on the remote planet Vortalis 7, buzzed with activity as a new batch of recruits arrived from across the galaxy. The sprawling facility, with its gleaming silver towers and holographic banners, stood as a testament to the unity of various alien civilizations that had come together in the name of interstellar peace and security. Among the crowd of fresh faces were beings of all shapes, sizes, and origins. Towering insectoid creatures clicked their mandibles nervously, amphibian-like recruits from the water world slithered onto dry land for the first time, and stoic humanoid soldiers adjusted their uniforms with military precision. In the midst of this eclectic gathering stood Captain Albert Hicks, a human representative from Earth. Albert scanned the area with a calm yet observant demeanor. The Earth soldier's compact frame, standing just under 6 feet tall, seemed almost insignificant compared to some of the larger recruits. Despite this, there was an air of quiet confidence about Albert that hinted at experience and competence. Dressed in the streamlined dark blue uniform of the United Nations Space Force, Albert carried a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and moved with the assured grace of someone accustomed to high-pressure environments. Nearby, a group of Titanian recruits, massive, muscular humanoids with skin that resembled stone, gathered in a circle, their deep voices booming across the courtyard. "Look at the humans," one of them scoffed, loud enough to be heard by everyone nearby. "Fragile little things. They won't last a week here, let alone in the field." The speaker was Crodor, a Titanian warrior who towered over everyone present. His broad shoulders and chiseled jaw gave him a statuesque appearance, and his voice carried the weight of someone used to commanding attention. Crodor's race was renowned for their physical prowess, often likened to walking tanks due to their natural strength and resilience. He eyed Albert with a mixture of amusement and disdain, as though the very idea of a human sharing the same training ground was a cosmic joke. Albert stopped and glanced in Crodor's direction, but said nothing. The momentary pause was enough to elicit laughter from Crodor's companions, who exchanged smug glances. Unfazed, Albert continued walking, heading toward the registration desk where holographic screens floated above a sleek metallic counter. Behind the desk, an insectoid officer with 6 arms processed recruits with mechanical efficiency, handing out orientation packets and assigning quarters. As Albert waited in line, snippets of conversations buzzed through the air. Recruits compared their homeworlds, boasted about their accomplishments, and speculated on the challenges ahead. Despite the chatter, Albert's focus remained sharp, the soldier's eyes occasionally flickering toward Crodor and his group. It was clear that the Titanian intended to make a spectacle of the human, but Albert wasn't about to rise to the bait. When it was finally Albert's turn, the insectoid officer greeted the human with a series of clicks before switching to the common galactic tongue, name and designation. "Captain Albert Hicks, United Nations Space Force, Earth." The officer's multifaceted eyes studied Albert briefly before typing something into the holographic interface. "Room 17B. Training orientation begins at 0600 hours. Your team assignment will be announced during the briefing." Next. Taking the assigned materials, Albert nodded politely and stepped aside, heading toward the barracks. The dormitories were a mix of functional design and alien architecture, with walls that shifted colors based on the time of day and atmospheric regulators that adjusted to the needs of diverse species. The corridors hummed with the sound of recruits settling in, and Albert quickly found the designated room. Inside, the Spartan accommodations were exactly what one would expect: a simple bunk, a storage unit, and a holographic console for accessing schedules and messages. Albert began unpacking with practiced efficiency, mentally preparing for the days ahead. However, it wasn't long before the peace was disrupted. A booming voice echoed down the hallway, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. "Where's the human? I want to see this so-called warrior up close." Albert sighed inwardly, already recognizing Crodor's voice. The Titanian appeared moments later, flanked by 2 of his companions. Their presence filled the narrow hallway, their sheer size making the space feel claustrophobic. Crodor leaned against the doorway, his stone-like skin glinting under the artificial lights. "So you're the one they sent from Earth," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I hope you brought more than just your little muscles. This isn't some low-gravity planet where you can fake your way through." Albert turned to face him, meeting Credor's gaze without flinching. "Something I can help you with?" the human asked evenly. The response seemed to catch Credor off guard, if only for a moment. He had expected anger or defensiveness, but Albert's calm demeanor only fueled his need to provoke. "I'm just trying to figure out why they bother sending your kind here," Credor continued. "We'll be lifting equipment and fighting on the front lines. What are you going to do? File paperwork?" The other Titanians chuckled, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Albert remained composed, refusing to be drawn into a pointless argument. "If you're finished, I have to prepare for tomorrow's briefing," Albert said, turning back to the task at hand. Credor's smile faded slightly, replaced by a glint of irritation. He wasn't used to being ignored, and Albert's lack of reaction only made him more determined to assert dominance. "Don't think you can hide behind that calm attitude forever," Credor said, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "When the time comes, we'll see what you're really made of." With that, he turned and stormed off, his companions following close behind. As the sound of their footsteps faded, Albert exhaled slowly, a small smirk playing at the corners of the soldier's lips. The encounter had been predictable, almost cliché, but Albert knew that actions would speak louder than words in the days to come. The first day at the academy had barely begun, and already the stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge perceptions and redefine what it meant to be human among the stars. The morning air at the Galactic Defense Academy was thick with anticipation as the recruits assembled for their first training session. The massive outdoor arena, encased by shimmering energy shields, buzzed with activity. Alien cadets of varying shapes and sizes stretched, adjusted their equipment, or conversed in hushed tones. Despite the diverse cacophony, one figure remained focused and silent: Captain Albert Hicks of Earth. Albert observed the surroundings with a calm intensity, analyzing the environment and the individuals within it. Across the arena, Credor stood out like a mountain amidst hills. The Titanian warrior, with his towering physique and confident posture, commanded the attention of those around him. His deep, rumbling laughter carried across the field as he spoke animatedly with his companions. It was clear he was basking in the spotlight, his earlier encounter with Albert fueling his bravado. The recruits soon gathered in neat formations as Commander Vrex, a reptilian figure with a sharp, angular face and a tail that swayed with authority, strode into the arena. Vrex's piercing yellow eyes scanned the crowd, ensuring silence before he spoke. "Welcome to the Galactic Defense Academy," his voice boomed, amplified by a holographic projector. "You are here because you are the best your worlds have to offer. But let me be clear here, none of that matters. Titles, reputations, physical attributes, none of it will protect you from what lies ahead. Only your actions and resilience will define you." The commander's words hung in the air like a challenge, and Albert felt a faint ripple of approval. This was the kind of environment where results mattered more than words, and Albert thrived on such meritocratic principles. However, the calm was soon interrupted by a low, mocking voice from the Titanian group. "Actions, huh? I'd love to see what actions the humans can muster," Credor muttered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. His companions chuckled, and a few other recruits glanced in Albert's direction, curious to see how the human would respond. Albert, however, remained impassive, focusing instead on the commander's instructions. The session began with a series of tests designed to evaluate the recruits' physical and mental capabilities. From navigating holographic obstacle courses to solving complex tactical puzzles under time constraints, the tasks were grueling. Albert tackled each challenge with precision, using strategy and adaptability to compensate for any perceived physical disadvantage. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, earning the quiet respect of a few observant recruits. Credor, on the other hand, dominated the physical trials with ease, his sheer strength and endurance making him a natural in tasks requiring brute force. He lifted massive weights, smashed through simulated barriers, and carried his team to victory in a tug-of-war exercise. Each display of strength was accompanied by his characteristic smugness, and it wasn't long before he turned his attention back to Albert. As the day progressed, the recruits were led to a section of the arena where various pieces of military equipment were arranged in neat rows. The commander explained the next exercise, moving the equipment from one end of the arena to the other within a set time limit. The task required teamwork, strength, and coordination, as some of the objects were far too heavy for any single recruit to handle alone. Credor seized the opportunity to issue a direct challenge. "How about we make this more interesting?" he called out, his booming voice cutting through the noise. "Let's see if the human can handle this without any help." All eyes turned to Albert, who stood motionless amidst the murmurs and whispers. Credor smirked, gesturing toward the largest piece of equipment in the lineup, a gravity regulator unit weighing over 3 tons. It was a monstrous, cube-like device with glowing panels and intricate wiring, clearly designed for heavy-duty operations. "Go on, Earthling," Credor taunted. "Show us what you've got." The commander's gaze flickered between Albert and Credor, but he made no move to intervene. This, after all, was a place to prove oneself, and Vrek seemed content to let the recruits settle their disputes within the bounds of the training exercise. Albert stepped forward, the quiet confidence radiating from every measured movement. "I'll give it a try," Albert said, the tone neutral and unassuming. The simplicity of the statement seemed to disarm the crowd, drawing a few skeptical chuckles but also a sense of intrigue. Credor crossed his arms, his stone-like skin gleaming under the artificial sunlight, ready to enjoy what he assumed would be an embarrassing failure. Albert approached the gravity regulator, studying it carefully. The human didn't rush or show any sign of frustration, instead circling the device to assess its structure and weight distribution. While others might have viewed the situation as an opportunity for raw display, Albert treated it as a problem to be solved, a puzzle requiring the right combination of strength, leverage, and technique. As Albert positioned hands on the edges of the regulator, a hush fell over the crowd. Even Credor seemed momentarily captivated, his smirk frozen as he watched the human's movements. Albert bent knees slightly, adjusting posture and grip, and with a controlled exhale began to lift. The first attempt was met with resistance, the sheer weight of the device pressing down like an immovable force. Albert didn't falter, instead resetting the stance and trying again, this time shifting the angle of the lift. A faint creak echoed as the device shifted, the audience leaning forward in collective anticipation. By the third attempt, Albert found the balance point, using the regulator's design to create leverage. With a surge of effort, the human hoisted the device off the ground, staggering briefly before stabilizing. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Albert began to move. Step by step, the human carried the 3-ton piece of equipment across the arena, every muscle in the compact frame working in unison. Sweat beaded on the brow, but the determination in Albert's eyes never wavered. The moment was surreal, a testament to human tenacity and ingenuity. Credor's expression darkened as the realization sank in. This wasn't the failure he had anticipated. Instead, Albert had turned the challenge into a quiet triumph, one that shattered the assumptions held by many in the crowd. By the time Albert set the regulator down at the designated spot, the arena was silent, the magnitude of the feat leaving even the most skeptical recruits in awe. Albert straightened, wiping sweat from her brow and meeting Credor's gaze. There was no smugness, no gloating, just a calm acknowledgement of the accomplishment. Credor, for the first time, found himself at a loss for words, the mockery fading into something resembling respect. The exercise continued, but the tone of the arena had shifted. Albert's actions spoke louder than any argument, and while Credor remained outwardly stoic, the seed of doubt had been planted. The challenge had been issued and met, but the rivalry was far from over. The quiet of Albert's dormitory that evening was a sharp contrast to the earlier events in the training arena. The triumph of carrying the 3-ton equipment had sent ripples through the academy, stirring up conversations and shifting perceptions among the recruits. For Albert, though, it was just another day. The human had no interest in theatrics or proving superiority. The goal was simple: to adapt, survive, and excel. But the growing attention wasn't something Albert could ignore, especially when it came with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. As the door to the room slid shut with a soft hiss, Albert sat on the edge of the bunk, reviewing the next day's training schedule on the holographic console. The exercises listed were daunting endurance drills, survival simulations, and advanced tactical scenarios, all designed to push recruits beyond their limits. Albert's focus sharpened. Preparation was key. Physical strength alone wouldn't be enough. Success at the Academy required strategy and adaptability, qualities that humanity had historically leaned on to thrive. Across the Academy, however, Credor was brooding. The Titanian's quarters were larger than Albert's, designed to accommodate his massive frame, but the space felt cramped under the weight of his frustration. His companions, who had initially shared his mockery of the human, now tread carefully around him, unsure how to navigate the silence. Credor's pride had taken a hit, and he wasn't accustomed to being challenged, let alone bested, in front of an audience. Earthling or not, he muttered to himself, no one embarrasses me like that. While Albert spent the evening refining techniques and mentally preparing for the next day, Credor was formulating a plan. He needed to reassert dominance, not just for his ego, but to remind everyone why Titanians were the premier warriors of the galaxy. To him, the human success was a fluke, an anomaly that could be crushed with the right approach. It wasn't about brute strength anymore. Credor had learned that much, but about strategy. If Albert wanted to play the game intelligently, Credor would rise to the challenge. Morning arrived with the Academy bathed in the golden glow of Vortalis 7's twin suns. The recruits assembled in the central courtyard, their chatter punctuated by the occasional hum of training drones hovering overhead. Albert arrived early, as always, scanning the crowd with a practiced eye. The human's presence, while understated, commanded attention. Conversations hushed as Albert walked past, the recruits parting subtly to make way. It was clear that the previous day's performance had left an impression. Credor was already there, his imposing figure towering over a group of fellow Titanians. He caught sight of Albert and smirked, his confidence seemingly restored. The day's exercises offered him another chance to prove himself, and this time he was determined not to falter. Commander Vrex arrived shortly after, his sharp gaze cutting through the crowd. Today's training will test your endurance, problem-solving skills, and teamwork, he announced. You'll be divided into teams and tasked with navigating a simulated combat scenario. Each team must retrieve a beacon from the center of the arena and return it to their base while facing a series of obstacles. The recruits exchanged glances, sizing up potential teammates. The simulation was designed to mimic real combat conditions, complete with environmental hazards, enemy drones, and limited resources. It wasn't just about strength, it required coordination, quick thinking, and trust. To no one's surprise, Credor immediately took charge of his group. His booming voice left no room for argument as he assigned roles and devised a strategy. He made it clear that he intended to dominate the exercise, and his teammates, eager to ride on his reputation, followed his lead without question. Albert, meanwhile, found themselves on a team with recruits from various species, none of whom were particularly familiar with each other. It was a mix of strengths and weaknesses: an amphibian navigator with sharp instincts, a small but agile insectoid technician, and a quiet humanoid sniper with keen eyesight. Unlike Credor's group, there was no natural leader here. Albert stepped into the role not by force but through quiet competence, offering suggestions and quickly gaining the trust of the others. As the simulation began, the arena transformed into a sprawling maze of rugged terrain, towering obstacles, and hostile drones. The recruits scattered, each team charting its own path toward the beacon. Credor's group moved with brute force, smashing through barriers and overpowering anything in their way. Their progress was fast but chaotic, leaving a trail of destruction that caught the attention of the drones. Alarms blared as automated defenses honed in on their location, slowing them down. Albert's team, in contrast, moved with calculated precision. They avoided unnecessary confrontations, using the insectoid's agility to scout ahead and the navigator's instincts to find hidden paths. When faced with drones, the sniper took them out with surgical accuracy, conserving energy and minimizing risks. Albert coordinated their efforts seamlessly, balancing the unique strengths of each teammate and keeping the group focused on their goal. The beacon itself was located in the heart of the arena, guarded by a formidable array of defenses. Credor's team reached it first, their brute force approach clearing the immediate area. But retrieving the beacon was no simple task. It was embedded in a pedestal surrounded by a complex locking mechanism that required precise calibration to disengage. Frustration mounted as Credor and his teammates struggled to decipher the mechanism. Their strength, so effective in other scenarios, was useless here. Every failed attempt triggered another wave of drones, forcing them to split their focus between defense and problem-solving. Meanwhile, Albert's team arrived unnoticed, observing the chaos from a distance. Albert quickly assessed the situation, formulating a plan. While the sniper provided cover, Albert and the technician approached the beacon under the cover of darkness. Using the insectoid's dexterity and Albert's keen understanding of mechanics, they began working on the lock with calm precision. Credor spotted them too late. "They're stealing our beacon," he roared, charging toward them with his teammates in tow. But the human and the insectoid had already completed their task. The beacon was freed, and Albert's team retreated swiftly, using their coordinated efforts to evade pursuit. The final stretch was a race against time. Credor's group, fueled by desperation, tried to catch up, but their earlier recklessness had left them vulnerable. They were bogged down by injuries and depleted resources, while Albert's team moved like a well-oiled machine. The humans' leadership had turned a ragtag group of recruits into a cohesive unit, and their victory was sealed as they crossed the finish line with the beacon in hand. As the simulation ended, the recruits gathered in the arena, their exhaustion overshadowed by the adrenaline of the competition. Credor's expression was a mix of anger and grudging respect as he approached Albert. "You got lucky," he muttered, though his tone lacked its usual venom. Albert simply nodded, offering no rebuttal. The results spoke for themselves, and there was no need to gloat. The lesson was clear: strength alone wasn't enough. It was adaptability, intelligence, and teamwork that defined true warriors. The days that followed the simulation brought a noticeable shift to the atmosphere at the Academy. Albert's team's victory had become the focal point of discussions among recruits, not just for the victory itself but for how it was achieved. The quiet human, whose presence had initially gone unnoticed by most, now carried an undeniable aura of respect. Yet for Albert, nothing about the routine had changed. Each day began early, filled with drills, strategy sessions, and problem-solving exercises. But success wasn't a destination but an ongoing process, one built on consistency and adaptability. For Credor, however, the sting of defeat lingered like a shadow. His pride had been bruised twice, first in the arena during the lifting challenge, and then during the simulation, where his brute force had been outmatched by Albert's strategic thinking. The Titanian warrior, once the unchallenged alpha figure among the recruits, now found his position questioned. It wasn't outright disrespect few dared to provoke him, but whispers and sidelong glances made it clear that the recruits had seen cracks in the Titanian's infallible exterior. Determined to reclaim his dominance, Credor spent every spare moment training harder, his massive frame moving like a relentless machine across the Academy's facilities. If his strength had failed to deliver victory before, then it was only because he hadn't pushed himself far enough. That was his rationale. Yet, despite his rigorous efforts, Credor's frustration grew. The more he trained, the more he realized that brute force wouldn't be enough to overcome Albert. To truly defeat the human, Credor needed to outthink and outlast his rival, a realization that gnawed at his ego. The opportunity for a decisive confrontation came during a morning briefing in the Academy's main hall. Commander Vrex, standing on the raised platform, outlined the next challenge, a test of strength, endurance, and sheer willpower. The recruits were tasked with transporting a series of heavy equipment pieces from one end of the arena to the other. The equipment varied in weight and complexity, and each recruit would need to complete the task alone. No teams, no assistants, just raw determination and ingenuity. The announcement was met with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The Academy's trials were known for their difficulty, and this one promised to be no exception. For Albert, the challenge was just another step in the ongoing process of proving adaptability. For Credor, it was the perfect stage to reassert his superiority. If there was one thing a Titanian prided themselves on, it was their strength. When the recruits gathered at the arena, the sight before them was daunting. Rows of heavy machinery, from massive gravity regulators to intricate weapon platforms, were lined up under the glaring sunlight. Each piece was labeled with its weight and required skill level. Among the equipment was a single, monstrous piece of command unit weighing over 5 tons. It stood apart from the others, its size and complexity making it seem more like a monument than something meant to be moved. No recruit in the Academy's history had ever attempted to transport it during this trial, It was meant as a psychological barrier, a way to remind recruits of their limitations. The briefing concluded with a simple directive: move as many pieces as possible within the allotted time. Recruits whispered among themselves, strategizing and calculating their limits. Credor, however, had eyes only for the command unit. If he could move that, no one, especially not Albert, would dare question his dominance again. As the trial began, recruits sprang into action. Some opted for smaller, more manageable pieces, prioritizing speed and efficiency. Others pushed their limits, attempting heavier loads to maximize their scores. Albert approached the task methodically, selecting pieces that balanced weight with complexity. The humans' movements were deliberate, conserving energy and focusing on technique. While others strained against the sheer weight of their loads, Albert used leverage and balance to offset physical limitations. Credor, meanwhile, bided his time. He moved a few smaller pieces to build momentum, his massive frame making the tasks appear effortless. Yet his focus never wavered from the command unit. When the halfway mark was announced, Credor made his move. The arena fell silent as the Titanian approached the massive structure, his intentions clear. His teammates watched with a mix of awe and apprehension, knowing that even for a Titanian, this was an almost impossible task. Credor squared his shoulders, his muscles tensing as he gripped the edges of the unit. With a deep, guttural growl, he began to lift. The ground seemed to tremble under the strain, the weight of the unit testing even his formidable strength. Slowly, inch by inch, the command unit rose, its massive bulk casting a long shadow across the arena. Cheers erupted from Credor's companions, their faith in him renewed. Yet, as he took his first step, it became clear that the task was far from over. The sheer weight of the unit made every movement a battle. Credor's breaths came in heavy, labored bursts, his massive frame trembling under the strain. The Titanian warrior pushed forward, his pride driving him beyond his limits. But as the seconds ticked by, the signs of exhaustion became evident. His steps slowed, his grip faltered, and the command unit wavered dangerously. Meanwhile, Albert observed the scene from a distance. The human's focus wasn't on Credor's struggle, but on the next task at hand. It wasn't arrogance or dismissal, it was simply a refusal to be distracted. Albert approached the final piece of equipment on the list, a smaller but intricate energy core that required precision to handle. With steady hands, Albert secured the core and began the journey across the arena. As Albert moved, a commotion erupted. Credor, pushed beyond his limits, had collapsed under the weight of the command unit. The structure crashed to the ground with a thunderous impact, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Medics rushed to Credor's side, their expressions a mix of concern and frustration. The Titanian warrior, though unharmed, lay on the ground, his pride shattered. When the trial concluded, the recruits gathered for the results. Albert's name was announced among the top performers, the human's methodical approach earning respect once again. Credor, despite his earlier bravado, was notably absent from the leaderboard. The contrast between the two was stark. One relied on strength alone, while the other balanced strength with strategy and resilience. As the crowd dispersed, Credor approached Albert. His expression was unreadable, a mix of lingering resentment and reluctant admiration. For a moment he stood in silence, the weight of the past days pressing down on him. "You're stronger than you look," he finally said, his tone subdued. Albert met his gaze and nodded. "Strength comes in many forms," the human replied simply. Credor said nothing more, but the exchange marked a turning point. The rivalry that had defined their interactions began to shift into something more complex. Respect, though unspoken, had taken root, and the seeds of camaraderie were sown. The trial had proven more than just physical capabilities, it had tested the very essence of what it meant to persevere. For Albert, it was another step forward. For Credor, it was the beginning of understanding that strength alone was never enough. The aftermath of the trial hung heavily over the Galactic Defense Academy. Recruits, still buzzing with the adrenaline of competition, mulled over the results. Discussions about the trial rippled through the corridors, dining halls, and training grounds. For some, it was a day of triumph; for others, a humbling reminder of their limits. Yet, the narrative that dominated every conversation was the clash between Albert Hicks and Credor, the human and the Titanian whose rivalry had become a defining spectacle of the Academy. Albert spent the evening as usual quiet, focused, and removed from the growing chatter. Sitting in the solitude of the dormitory, the human reviewed notes on upcoming drills and tactics. The trial, though taxing, was just another step in a much larger journey. Albert wasn't driven by pride or recognition, but by a quiet determination to excel. The victory wasn't something to celebrate, but rather a benchmark for improvement. The human's meticulous approach left no room for complacency. Elsewhere, Crador grappled with the weight of failure. In his private quarters, the Titanian stared at his reflection in the polished surface of his room's console. The face that stared back seemed unfamiliar, a warrior whose confidence had been eroded by 2 consecutive defeats. His mind replayed the trial's events in excruciating detail, each misstep a thorn in his pride. Crador's strength had always been his defining trait, the foundation of his identity. To see it falter against someone he had dismissed as weak shook him to his core. But within that turmoil lay the seed of introspection. Crador, for all his bluster, wasn't foolish. He recognized that Albert's success wasn't luck or circumstance, it was the result of strategy, preparation, and an unyielding will. These were qualities he had overlooked in his single-minded focus on brute force. For the first time, Crador began to question his approach, not just to the trials but to his role as a warrior. The next day, the Academy's commander Vrex summoned the recruits to the central hall for a debriefing. The room, vast and domed, echoed with the sounds of shuffling feet as the recruits assembled. Holographic displays flickered to life, projecting the results of the trial, along with key moments captured by the arena's surveillance systems. The debriefing was as much a learning opportunity as it was a showcase of the recruits' performance. Strength, Vrex began, his commanding voice silencing the murmurs, is more than just the ability to lift heavy objects or overpower an opponent. True strength lies in resilience, adaptability, and the capacity to work as a cohesive unit. Yesterday's trial was designed to test more than physical limits. It was a measure of your character and your ability to think under pressure. As the commander spoke, Albert stood among the recruits, listening intently. Crador, positioned several rows away, kept his gaze fixed on the displays. Footage of the trial played in the background, highlighting key moments. Crador's initial successes were shown, followed by his struggle with the command unit. The image of the massive structure crashing to the ground drew a collective murmur from the recruits. Then came Albert's performance, a masterclass in efficiency and precision. The human's calm, calculated approach stood in stark contrast to Crador's brute force, and the room seemed to hold its breath as the footage concluded. Vrex turned his attention to Albert. "Captain Hicks," he said, addressing the human directly, "your performance was exemplary. You demonstrated not only physical capability but also the intelligence and composure necessary to succeed in high-stress situations. Well done." A ripple of applause spread through the hall, subdued but genuine. Albert nodded in acknowledgement, offering no more than a polite smile. The recognition was appreciated, but there was no satisfaction in dwelling on past successes. The human's focus remained on what lay ahead. The commander's gaze shifted to Crador. "Crador of Titania," Vrex continued, his tone firm but not unkind, "your strength is undeniable, but strength without strategy is a weapon wielded without purpose. Learn from this. Adapt. A warrior who cannot evolve will find themselves obsolete." The words struck Crador like a hammer, but they carried no malice. Instead, they were a challenge, a call to rise above his limitations. The Titanian nodded, his jaw tight with resolve. He had no intention of remaining in Albert's shadow, but he now understood that brute force alone wouldn't suffice. As the debriefing concluded, the recruits were dismissed. The hall emptied slowly, the weight of Vrex's words lingering in the air. Albert made no effort to engage with the others, slipping away to review the next training schedule. But as the human turned toward the exit, a familiar figure blocked the path. Crador stood there, his massive frame casting a shadow over the smaller human. For a moment the two said nothing, the silence between them heavy with unspoken tension. Then, to Albert's surprise, Crador extended a hand. "You earned it," Crador said, his voice low but steady. "The victory, the respect. You earned it." Albert studied the Titanian's expression, noting the sincerity in his words. After a brief pause, the human shook his hand. "So did you," Albert replied. "You just don't see it yet." The exchange, though brief, marked a turning point. The rivalry that had defined their interactions began to dissolve, replaced by something resembling mutual respect. Credor's pride remained intact, but it was tempered by a newfound humility. Albert, ever pragmatic, recognized the potential for camaraderie in the shared pursuit of excellence. Over the following weeks, the dynamic between Albert and Credor evolved. While their interactions were still marked by competition, it was no longer fueled by animosity. Instead, it became a driving force that pushed both to improve. Credor began to adopt some of Albert's methods, incorporating strategy into his training. Albert, in turn, found value in Credor's relentless drive and physical prowess. Together, they became unlikely allies, their strengths complementing each other in ways neither had anticipated. By the time the Academy's final trials approached, the human and the Titanian had forged a bond rooted in mutual respect. They stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey had tested their limits, reshaped their perceptions, and ultimately redefined what it meant to be strong. In the end, it wasn't about victory or dominance. It was about growth, learning from failures, building on successes, and finding strength in unity. And as the stars of Vortalis 7 shimmered above the Academy, Albert and Credor stood as living proof that even the most unlikely rivals could become allies in the pursuit of greatness.